President, as the House of Representatives moves closer to a vote on the Senate-passed legislation to renew Trade Promotion Authority, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the links between our nation's trade policy, foreign policy, and national security. Whether it's Russia's aggression toward the Ukraine, civil wars in the Middle East, or ongoing efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation, the world faces a number of challenges that are impacting the future geopolitical landscape. In all of this, the question we have to consider is, going forward, what role will the U.S. play? Are we going to lead, or are we going to follow? Make no mistake, the path we take on international trade will say a lot about how we plan to answer that question. Consider a few facts. In the next few years, China will pass the U.S. as the world's largest economy. It is already the world's largest exporting country. China is continually seeking to expand its influence in order to dictate the terms of international trade, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and Latin America. In other words, Mr. President, when we're talking about trade and the possibility of the U.S. retreating from the international marketplace, China is the proverbial 800-pound gorilla in the room. Indeed, any ground we cede in leading the world on trade is more likely than not ground ceded to China. I've heard many people, including members of Congress, express their concerns about China, both strategically and economically, and rightfully so. After all, when it comes to trade, China has constantly shown a disregard for international norms and standards. However, oddly enough, many of those same people who talk the most about the threat posed by China have expressed opposition to TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority bill, and to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. This is puzzling and reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the Senate TPA bill and free trade in general. If we're serious about keeping China and its growing economic and political influence in check, getting a strong TPP agreement that advances U.S. interests should be a top priority. In addition, if we want to eventually convince China to change their harmful practices, a high-standard TPP agreement would naturally be a big step in the right direction. Free trade agreements like TPP, if done correctly, should provide new rules for trade in the 21st century. They should set modern standards for economic liberalization and integration, including the protection of foreign investments and intellectual property rights, and the marginalization of state-owned enterprises. We need to be setting the standards and writing the rules on trade so that our workers, innovators, researchers, and job creators can fairly compete in the global market. If we don't lead, if we sit on the sidelines, Americans will be competing on an imbalanced playing field with rules designed specifically to disadvantage us. Given the TPP countries comprise 40% of the world economy, it is vital that we improve our ability to compete in that region. Moreover, if TPP fails, we will lose influence in one of the most economically dynamic and strategic regions of the world. And any leadership vacuum left by the U.S. will almost certainly be filled by someone else, in this case, most likely China. But don't just take my word for it. Congress recently received a letter from 17 former Secretaries of Defense and retired military leaders, including Colin Powell, Leon Panetta, William Perry, and Donald Rumsfeld. In that letter, these leaders said, and I quote, "We write to express our strongest possible support for enactment of Trade Promotion Authority legislation, which is critical to the successful conclusion of two vital agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. Indeed, TPP in particular will shape an economic dynamic over the next several decades that will link the United States with one of the world's most vibrant and dynamic regions. If, however, we fail to move forward with TPP, Asian economies will almost certainly develop along a China-centric model. In fact, China is already pursuing an alternative regional free trade initiative. TPP combined with TTIP would allow the United States and our closest allies to help shape the rules and standards for global trade. The concerns outlined in this letter went beyond China. The letter continues, quote, "The stakes are clear. There are tremendous strategic benefits to TPP and TTIP, and there would be harmful strategic consequences if we fail to secure these agreements. In both Asia-Pacific and the Atlantic, our allies and partners would question our commitments, doubt our resolve, and inevitably look to other partners. America's prestige, influence, and leadership are on the line. With TPP originating in the Bush administration, these agreements are fundamentally bipartisan in nature and squarely in our national security interest. It is vitally important that we seize the new strategic opportunities these agreements offer our nation," unquote. When 17 former secretaries of defense, admirals, and generals who served under both Republican and Democratic administrations joined together with such a strong message, they probably have a point. And Congress had better listen closely. Many people, including a number of our colleagues here in Congress, continually argue that one of the best uses of American power would be to better promote human rights and democracy in developing countries and increase our efforts at alleviating poverty. I don't necessarily disagree with that sentiment. Indeed, while there are different opinions about how we can best accomplish these goals, I think most of us here in Congress, in both the Senate and the House, agree with the basic premise that we should continually be working to expand our influence and advance our values, particularly in the developing world. History has demonstrated that the best way to accomplish these objectives is to increase U.S. trade with these countries. Indeed, if we want to export the benefits of American exceptionalism, capitalism, work ethic, and democracy, a freer, expanded exchange of goods is the absolutely best way to do it. Trade, Mr. President, is an effective exercise of America's economic power and influence. Trade is how you spread capitalism and encourage other countries to open their economies. Trade is how you export American values in the developing world. And most importantly, trade is how you counter the growing influence of countries like China in the world economy. The stakes are high. The importance of TPP and other trade agreements to our strategic and security interests is obvious. Mr. President, it's obvious. And given that reality, the importance of TPA should be just as obvious. Put simply, without TPA, there is no TPP. That's just a fact. Sure, technically speaking, TPA is not required for the administration to complete negotiations and send the agreement to Congress. But technicalities aside, that route is unlikely to yield desirable results, both in terms of the substance and the process. Japan and Canada, two of our largest trading partners in the TPP negotiations, have each stated that they are reluctant to bring their final offers to the table until Congress provides the administration with TPA. Trade Promotion Authority assures our trading partners that if they reach an agreement, it won't be unraveled when it is sent to Congress for approval. This allows our negotiators to get the best deal possible on both sides, but especially our negotiators. TPA also ensures that Congress has a meaningful role in crafting the specifics of the agreement by setting objectives, mandating transparency, and requiring periodic updates. And under the Senate-passed bill, Congress will have more authority than ever to review and respond to the administration on individual trade agreements. Long story short, Mr. President, TPA is absolutely necessary for advancing U.S. interests abroad and protecting the opportunities for millions of Americans to earn and compete for a livelihood in an increasingly global trade environment. With the House TPA vote set to take place in a matter of days, I hope our colleagues in the other chamber will recognize the strategic and economic realities we face as a country and vote to advance our nation's interests and security. I am confident that most of them will make the right choice, and it will be good for America as well as them. Now, Mr. President, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about another matter of great importance, not just to me, but to everybody. Last year, after the midterm elections, the Obama administration quietly and without much fanfare proposed a massive, far-reaching rule that would overturn a number of bedrock principles of child support enforcement and welfare reform. Chief among them being the principle that parents should be financially responsible for their children. This was just the latest attempt on the part of the Obama administration to bypass Congress in order to enact policies through executive fiat. And sadly, it wasn't even the first time this administration has tried to gut welfare reform. Indeed, we all remember a few years back when the administration granted itself the unprecedented authority to waive critical welfare work requirements. Put simply, this latest rule would make it easier for non-custodial parents to evade paying child support. It would undermine a key feature of welfare reform, which is that single mothers can avoid welfare if fathers comply with child support orders. I am fundamentally opposed to policies that allow parents to abdicate their responsibilities, which in turn results in more families having to go on welfare. I think most Americans would agree with me. That is why I, joined by Senator Cornyn and House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Paul Ryan, have introduced legislation that would prevent the Obama administration from bypassing Congress and yet another attempt to subvert key features of welfare reform. I regret that we must take this action. In the past, members of Congress have generally been able to find common ground and work on a bipartisan basis to address issues relating to child support. In fact, Congress recently passed and the President recently signed legislation that made improvements to child support enforcement policies. In 2013, the Senate Finance Committee reported a series of ambitious proposals related to child support enforcement. At that time, we requested input on these proposals from the Obama administration. At no time did administration officials indicate that the Department of Health and Human Services was quietly working to advance a massive overhaul of child support enforcement, much less that it was planning on doing so without the help or input of Congress. It's important to note that this secretive preparation only came to light after the recent elections. That suggests to me that the administration does not have faith that its proposal can withstand public scrutiny and that they have no interest in making a full and transparent justification for the policies they are trying to ram through. Truth be told, Chairman Ryan and I have introduced our legislation more out of sorrow than anger. For many months, our offices attempted to work out an equitable arrangement with the Obama administration. We tried to convince HHS to withdraw the problematic features of the rule, and in exchange, we would agree to engage in a substantive, productive discussion on how to move forward with improvements to child support enforcement. I firmly believe that there is room for common ground. In fact, there are a number of features of the administration's proposed rule that could generate bipartisan support. But any workable solution would have to include the full participation and ultimate consent of the legislative branch. Any changes to the law would have to go through Congress and not simply be dictated by the administration. So, Mr. President, Chairman Ryan and I will do all we can to get our bill through Congress and present it to the President. If we're successful, I hope he will sign it and commit to working with us in the future to advance reforms to child support enforcement. I stand ready to work with the administration and any of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Capitol to achieve this goal. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Oggs.